All right, we're going to continue today with our discussion about the Renaissance and the Reformation. And here we talk about the Reformation spreading beyond northern Germany. Our objectives in this section will describe the new ideas that these several Protestant sects embrace, and we'll mention a few specifically. We'll understand why England forms a new church away from the Catholic Church, and the reasons are significantly different than they were, for the most part, in northern Germany. We'll also analyze the reaction of the Catholic Church as it sees the Protestant Reformation and all these different sects break away from the Catholic Church. What is the reaction of the Catholic Church? What efforts do they make to reform? And then finally, we will look to see how many other groups faced different persecution during the Reformation, both people of other faiths and people who might have just been different. Our focus question: how did the Reformation bring about two different religious paths in Europe? Throughout Europe, we'll see that most of the people do remain Catholic, but we also have Catholic kings in the Catholic Church fighting against what they see as the challenge of these Protestants, taking steps to reform the Catholic Church itself and to restore its role as the leader, the spiritual leader of the Christian world. But despite their efforts, the ideas of the Protestant Reformation continue to spread beyond their origin in northern Germany. As the Reformation continues, hundreds, and I do mean hundreds, of new Protestant sects appear. Some of these different sects break away from mainline churches. Some end up being very small denominations. Some end up being very large. Most of these follow the teachings of either Luther, Calvin, or Zwingli. Some of these churches have ideas and beliefs that are much more radical. Now you can see here I've got two different family trees, if you will. You don't necessarily have to know all the detail of these, but it's important to point out the origin of the different branches of the Catholic Church. And we've talked about the Great Schism in 1054, where the Western Church and the Eastern Church split. Now we see with Martin Luther the Protestant split, and then beneath the Protestant split we have Lutheran churches, we'll have Anglican churches in England, and we'll also have various forms of the Calvinist church. Here's another, and if you will, more complicated way to look at it. But you can see all the different denominations, many of which we still know today, anything from Vineyard Fellowship to Church of God, Church of Christ, the Southern Baptist, the Lutheran, the Quakers, and many others. One of these new sects was the Anabaptists. Now, the main belief to remember about the Anabaptists is they rejected the idea of baptizing infants. And the reason being that they felt that an infant didn't really have the capacity to understand what the meaning of a baptism was. So they preferred to wait until someone reached the age of maturation. Now, there were some within the Anabaptists that took it much further, and they favored getting rid of private property, if you will, having it be community property for everyone, and also even taking up acts of violence in order to speed up the day of judgment. So that's pretty radical, even more than most of the Anabaptists would do. But most Anabaptists were peaceful. They called for toleration of other faiths and the separation between the government and the church. So if you think back to the theocracies that we talked about, the Anabaptists generally would have been against that. They would have argued that the church should be separate from the government. If you trace the Anabaptist lineage forward in history, you'll see that they come to be in various forms. The Baptist denominations, the Mennonites, and even the Amish can trace their origins back to the Anabaptist. Here's a quick map. You can see where within the Holy Roman Empire, within what we call Germany, the different areas where there were groups of Anabaptist and Anabaptist communities. Now, the Protestant Reformation in England is very much different than it was elsewhere. It's not so much due to the actions or the ideas of spiritual or religious reformers, but rather due to the actions of a king. In this case, King Henry VIII of England. Now, prior to this time that we're going to talk about, King Henry VIII had very much been in support of the Catholic Church. Matter of fact, the Pope even called him a defender of the faith. And there's a quote in the beginning of this section from a letter that King Henry VIII wrote regarding how displeased he was with Martin Luther and his teachings. He says, "We believe that no duty is more incumbent on a Catholic sovereign than to preserve and increase the Catholic faith. So when we learned that the pest of Martin Luther's heresy had appeared in Germany and was raging everywhere, we bent all our thoughts and energies upon uprooting those heresies in every possible way." So up until this point, very much a supporter of the Catholic Church. But personal circumstances come into being where he has a change of heart, if you will. So here's Henry VIII, and here's the process that happens here. In 1527, Henry, who had been married to Catherine, asked the Pope to annul the marriage to his wife, primarily because his wife Catherine had only borne him a daughter, no sons. And that daughter, of course, is Mary Tudor. Now, it's important to note that Catherine, the wife of Henry VIII, is the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Charles V. Now, remember Charles V and his actions regarding Martin Luther. So Charles V is the nephew of Catherine. And the Pope denied the annulment for Henry because he didn't want to offend the very Catholic Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, annulments had been granted in the past, so it generally was not a big deal for the Pope to grant this to a monarch, but in this case he chose not to. Now, this simply infuriated Henry VIII. His desire was to marry a noblewoman, Anne Boleyn, who he had already fallen in love with, in the hopes that she would be able to bear him a male child. And again, the Pope refused to annul the marriage so as not to offend Charles V, so Henry took action into his own hand. He, in working with his Chancellor, Thomas Cromwell, persuaded the English Parliament to allow King Henry VIII to take over the English Church. He would actually be referred to as the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. So Parliament passes control of the Church of England under Henry VIII's control. A gentleman by the name of Thomas Cranmer is appointed Archbishop. And once Henry VIII has his own appointed Archbishop in place, his marriage to Catherine is annulled. He marries Anne Boleyn, and they have not a son, but a daughter, and that daughter is Elizabeth, who we'll talk about a little bit more down the road. Now, as you can imagine, not all of the people in England, especially those that preferred the Catholic faith, for the most part, that would have been the peasants who were able to grow food on the lands of the Catholic Church, and others who were a part of the Catholic Church. They weren't very happy about this. They refused to accept this act of supremacy, and many of them were executed for treason at this point. So a lot of conflict between the Anglican Church, which is the Protestant Church in England, and the Catholic Church. One person who refused to accept what Henry VIII had done is Thomas More. Now, Sir Thomas More had served in the government. He tried to resign in protest. Now, you'll remember we talked about Thomas More as a humanist writer and thinker and religious figure. He wrote the book Utopia, refused to accept the actions of Henry VIII, and he for this was executed. Now, ultimately, he's canonized or sainted by the Catholic Church. So here's a chart or composite picture showing the 6 wives of Henry VIII. First, we had Catherine of Aragon. Second, Anne Boleyn, who is also at some point, or she is the first to be executed. Next, we have Jane Seymour, who dies several days after giving birth, largely believed to be from complications of that birth. And Jane Seymour is the mother of the son who becomes King Edward. Next, we have Anne of Cleves. That marriage eventually is annulled as well. We have Catherine Howard, who is also executed. And then finally, we have Catherine Parr, who is ultimately widowed as she is married to Henry VIII when Henry passes. Now, once Henry took control of the Church of England as the supreme head of the Church of England, he confiscated all the Catholic Church property in England, the monasteries, the abbeys, and the like, and all the church land, and he redistributed that to the nobles and all the wealth within those properties too, in order to gain their support. So you can imagine, just as we've talked about fiefs being given in the Middle Ages, the nobles were much more likely to support Henry and his actions in the Protestant Church because of the wealth and the wealth and the prestige that they received as a result of the actions. When Henry died, next in line for the throne was his 9-year-old son, Edward. Edward, as we've talked about, very much favored the Protestant religion, and even more so the Lutheran version of the Protestant faith, not necessarily just the change the name from Catholic to Anglican version that Henry VIII preferred. Parliament passes a series of laws that make the English or the Anglican Church even more Protestant, and again, following the lead of Edward at this point. The Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer, comes up with the Book of Common Prayer, which is required to be read at all Anglican services. Edward is not very healthy. He dies of tuberculosis at a very young age, and he is succeeded, according to the hereditary rule of Henry VIII, by Henry VIII's oldest daughter, that being Mary Tudor, the son of Henry and Catherine. Now, Mary Tudor is very much Catholic. So she makes significant effort to restore Catholicism, get rid of the Anglican Church that has been coming into being in the preceding years. She restores Catholicism, and likewise, many Protestants are now burned at the stake for not going along with her efforts to return to the Catholic Church. So chaos in England during this time, as you can imagine. Upon Mary's death in 1558, the 25-year-old Elizabeth takes the throne, and we have the beginning of the Elizabethan era. And Elizabeth really makes great strides in ending the religious conflict, at least in the near term, in England. Sometimes her rule is referred to as the Elizabethan settlement, and she's able to find common ground between Catholics and Protestants. First, she doesn't allow herself to be put at the head of the Anglican Church, but she does keep a lot of the Catholic ritual of the Catholic Church, keeping the hierarchy of bishops and archbishops. She restores the version of the Book of Common Prayer written by Mr. Cranmer, accepts a Protestant doctrine that is very moderate and not exactly what the Catholic is. And if you talk with Anglicans or Episcopals, as it's sometimes called as well, practicing today, sometimes this is called Catholic Light. So it looks a lot like the Catholic Church, but it's not quite the Catholic Church. It has some elements of Protestant faith as well, including doing the services, performing the services in English, not in the Latin, which we had in the Catholic Church up until much more recent modern times. So this is where we stand by the time we get to 1600. You can see that a significant part of Europe remains Roman Catholic. Spain, France, parts of Ireland, parts of the Holy Roman Empire remain Catholic. Lutheranism spreading in the north, Norway, Sweden. Lutheranism also is over there in Iceland, off to the left behind the key to the map. We have Calvinism spreading from some pockets there in the Holy Roman Empire, but also in some places in France and certainly in Scotland. So what is the Catholic Church's reaction to Lutheranism and the Protestant Reformation? Well, we have from 1530 to the 1540s, the Pope Paul III, leads a movement to reform the Catholic Church, so sometimes called the Catholic Reformation. Another name for it might be the Counter-Reformation. 1545, the Pope calls together a council or a meeting called the Council of Trent, the purpose of which is to end corruption within the Catholic Church, the worldliness of the Church, and to talk about and finally settle on some key issues of church doctrine. Now, it's important to note that the Council of Trent isn't just a one-time meeting. It happens on and off several different times over the next 20 years. Now, the council makes a few decisions. First, they declare that, consistent with the way the doctrine had been stated, that salvation or heaven comes from not just faith, but through faith and good works. Now, remember, this differs from what Martin Luther said, where faith alone will get one to heaven. So the Catholic Church sticks to their belief that it is both faith and good works. It also sticks with its belief that the Bible is a major source of religious truth, but compromises a bit that it is not the only source. The church also is working to fight corruption within the church, and it creates stiff penalties for any corruption that is found to exist in the clergy. The Pope also moves to strengthen the Inquisition to fight against Protestantism. So they're not just looking at their own doctrine. They are aggressively moving forward and rooting out in those Catholic countries those that are practicing the Protestant faith. So remember the Inquisition. We talked about it in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, 1492. Pope Paul encourages that, not just in Spain, but in other areas as well. So a special court set up to determine whether or not someone truly is practicing the Catholic faith as the Church professes. Make sure that those Protestant heretics are not worshiping among us. And it was pretty brutal. They took testimony in private, in secret, and punishments, torture, and even executions were very common. The Church also puts together an index of forbidden books. So we talk a lot about banned books. Well, the Church did that as well. Many of these books they considered immoral, irreligious books that Catholics were not allowed to have, not allowed to read. Of course, these included the writings of John Calvin and Martin Luther. Additional reactions from the Catholic Church. 1540, the Pope recognizes a new religious order, the Jesuits, an order that you should be very familiar with, as we have several Jesuit institutions in the greater Cincinnati area. Now, the Jesuits are founded by a Spanish knight, Ignatius of Loyola, founded at the order as a group of soldiers of God, and they were aggressively willing to defend and spread the Catholic faith. Jesuits follow a very strict moral code and spiritual rules. They themselves train very rigorously, require complete obedience to the Catholic Church. And in modern times, and even back then, they're known for their emphasis on education, acting as missionaries, spreading the Catholic faith, but again, encouraging education in order to better understand faith and to better share that faith with others. So one reaction again is the founding of the Jesuits. Now, during the Counter-Reformation, there were a lot of Catholics that felt a very much an increased sense of passion and renewed feelings of a very intense faith. Among those was a lady by the name of Teresa of Avila, who entered the convent very young. She was from a very wealthy Spanish family, and she entered the convent, but she felt very early on that the convent routine wasn't strict enough, and she established her own order of nuns that were much more strict and rigid in their devotion. So she lived, and her order lived in isolation, eating and sleeping very little, dedicating themselves 100% to prayer and meditation. Now, her superiors and others appreciated what she was able to do and encouraged her to reorganize and reform Spanish monasteries and convents throughout the country, bringing her order of nuns to these areas. Teresa herself, after her death, is also made a saint and canonized. So if you remember back to the map that we looked at by 1600, we still have the majority of people in Europe who are remaining Catholic, but we have Protestantism making a major foothold in its different denominations, its different sects throughout the continent. The efforts of the Catholic Church, the reaction to the Protestant Reformation, succeeded in bringing many of those Protestants back into the Catholic Church. A lot of things were corrected or improved that were originally complaints of those Protestants breaking away. But we continue to have religious conflict, and religious conflict spills over into political conflict and political debate. So we do have in the 1600s significant violence and conflict throughout most of Europe. Now, all this passion that comes out of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, heightens the passions about religion. Well, unfortunately, that also results in a higher level of persecution and intolerance for those that are different. And what we see happen between 1450 and 1750 are tens of thousands of people, mostly women, who are killed as witches. Now, most of this happens in the German states, in the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, and France, but we do see it occasionally in other parts of Europe, and even if you remember the Salem witch trials, we see it occasionally in North America. Now, it's strange to look at it from our 21st century viewpoint, but back in this time period, 1450 to 1750, belief in witchcraft existed, and it was sort of a twin belief standing side by side with Christianity. So witches were seen, and witches could have been deemed anyone who was a social outcast, anyone who was not necessarily like the rest of them, whether that was because of some kind of handicap, mental or physical, or some people who just acted different. But they were seen as agents of the devil, and thus they were seen as anti-Christian. Now, one thing we saw as the religious conflict begins to ebb at the end of this time period, we also see the persecution of witches decrease as well. Another group facing persecution, as you can imagine, with all these different versions of Christianity, are Jews. And Jews increasingly face persecution, restrictions, and even death throughout the period of the Reformation. Now, many of the Jews, as you'll remember, were expelled from Spain in 1492 as part of the Reconquista. At this point, they had fled to some parts of Europe. Some went to the Ottoman Empire, and some went up north into the Netherlands, where, at least at some points in time, the populations were tolerated. Some of them did go to Europe, and in 1516, the city of Venice orders that Jews living in Venice be required to live in a separate part, a segregated part of the city that came to be known as a ghetto. And that's where we get the word ghetto. Martin Luther likewise called for their expulsion from German lands, Holy Roman Empire lands, and expel them to the northern parts of Europe. And in the 1550s, the Pope adds new restrictions to the Jewish people as well. So difficult time as the Christian passion grows in Europe and beyond for those Jews and those practicing other faiths. So our terms and people, a sect is a subgroup of a major religious group. So those Protestant sects, whether they're Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, and the like, are all considered sects of the Protestant faith, which is part of the larger Christian faith umbrella. Henry VIII, King of England, causes England to break away from the Catholic Church. 6 wives of Henry VIII. Mary Tudor, Catholic queen, the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon. She works to restore Catholicism to England after Henry VIII and Edward had made it Protestant and brought in the Anglican Church. Thomas Cranmer, the first archbishop that Henry VIII names to the Church of England. He wrote the Book of Common Prayer, which was even reinstated by Elizabeth once she followed Mary Tudor to the throne. Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII, she was queen for a good long time, 45 years, and really known as the Great Compromiser. So the Elizabethan Compromise, the Elizabethan period, bringing a decline in the conflict, at least in England, between Catholics and Protestants. To canonize is to recognize someone as a saint, and this is something that's performed by the Pope and the Church. Compromise, something Elizabeth did very well between Protestants and Catholics, to find an acceptable middle ground. Again, a word that we don't hear very often in modern times, and that's quite unfortunate. The Council of Trent, a part of the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, begins in 1545, meets off and on over a period of about 20 years, looking at church doctrine, establishing reforms to respond to the challenge of the Protestants. Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, known today primarily for their emphasis on education. Teresa of Avila began her own order of nuns and also was instrumental in reforming other Spanish Catholic convents and monasteries. And finally, ghetto, separate section of a city where members of a minority group, in the case of this section, the Jews in Venice, are forced to live. So that brings us to the conclusion of this section, the spread of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and a discussion on some of those others that were persecuted in the passion of these reformations.